The morning sunlight filtered through the tall windows of the private wing at Portland Hospital, casting gentle shadows across the room where Princess Beatrice of York sat quietly, her hands resting protectively over her growing belly. It was September 2021, and at 33 years old, she had never imagined that pregnancy would bring such unexpected challenges. The fairy tale narrative that often surrounded royal pregnancies seemed far removed from her current reality. Beatrice had always been the more reserved of the York sisters, preferring to stay out of the spotlight that seemed to follow her younger sister Eugenie effortlessly. When she married Edoardo Mapelli-Mazzi in July 2020, their small, intimate ceremony during the pandemic had perfectly reflected her desire for privacy. Now, carrying her first child, she found herself facing circumstances that would test that preference for keeping personal matters private. The first sign that something was different came during what should have been a routine appointment at 28 weeks. Dr. Sarah Mitchell, her obstetrician, had been monitoring the pregnancy closely due to Beatrice's family history. The Duchess of York, her mother Sarah Ferguson, had experienced complications during both her pregnancies, and medical professionals were taking no chances with the next generation. "Your blood pressure readings are concerning," Dr. Mitchell had said, her voice calm but serious. "We need to discuss the possibility of early delivery if this continues to escalate." The words hung in the air like a weight Beatrice hadn't expected to carry. She had read all the pregnancy books, attended the classes, prepared the nursery in her Cotswolds home, but none of it had prepared her for this moment. Edoardo squeezed her hand as they listened to the doctor explain preeclampsia, a condition that affects roughly 5 to 8% of pregnancies, but can be particularly dangerous if left untreated. The irony wasn't lost on Beatrice that despite having access to the best medical care in the world, she was facing the same fears and uncertainties as thousands of other expectant mothers. That evening, as they drove back to their home in the countryside, Beatrice stared out the window at the familiar landscape. The rolling hills and ancient oak trees had always brought her comfort, but tonight they seemed to blur together as her mind raced with questions. Would her baby be healthy if born early? What would the next few weeks hold? How would she explain this to her family, who had already been through so much public scrutiny over the years? Edoardo, ever the supportive partner, tried to maintain an optimistic outlook. "We'll take it one day at a time," he said, his Italian accent making the words sound almost musical despite the gravity of the situation. "The doctors caught it early. That has to count for something." Beatrice nodded, but privately she wondered if being royal made these situations better or worse. The pressure to maintain appearances, even in private medical matters, was something she had grown up with but never fully accepted. The weeks that followed became a careful balance of monitoring and waiting. Twice-weekly appointments became the new routine, with blood pressure checks, protein level tests, and fetal monitoring sessions that seemed to stretch endlessly. Beatrice found herself becoming an expert in medical terminology she never wanted to learn. Proteinuria, oligohydramnios, IUJAR. These words became part of her daily vocabulary as she navigated a world that felt increasingly uncertain. During one particularly difficult week in early October, when her blood pressure spiked dangerously high, Dr. Mitchell made the decision that Beatrice had been dreading. "We need to deliver the baby now," she said during what was supposed to be a routine checkup. "Waiting any longer puts both of you at risk." The baby would be born at 32 weeks, 8 weeks earlier than the planned delivery date. The next few hours passed in a blur of activity that felt surreal. Phone calls to family members, last-minute preparations, and the strange reality of knowing that within hours she would meet her child under circumstances she had never imagined. Princess and her aunt had once told her that royal life required adapting to unexpected situations with grace, but this felt like a test she hadn't studied for. As she was wheeled into the delivery room, Beatrice thought about all the royal births that had come before hers. The elaborate announcements, the crowds gathered outside hospitals, the carefully orchestrated media coverage. Her experience will be different, quieter, more private, but also more frightening. The weight of worry replaced the weight of expectation, and in some ways, that felt more authentic than anything she had experienced in her public role. The medical team that surrounded her was exceptional, led by Dr. Mitchell and including specialists in neonatal care who had been called in specifically for premature deliveries. "You're in excellent hands," the anesthesiologist assured her as they prepared for the cesarean section that had become necessary due to the complications. Beatrice tried to find comfort in their expertise while grappling with the reality that her birth plan, like so many aspects of royal life, was ultimately not hers to control. Eduardo remained by her side throughout the procedure, his presence a steady anchor in what felt like an ocean of uncertainty. The delivery room, with its bright lights and constant monitoring beeps, was a far cry from the peaceful, natural birth experience Beatrice had envisioned. Yet as the moment approached when she would finally meet her child, she found herself letting go of those expectations and focusing instead on the hope that everything would be all right. The sound of the baby's first cry, though weaker than full-term babies typically manage, filled the room with a mixture of relief and new worry. "It's a girl," Dr. Mitchell announced. And for a moment, the medical complications faded into the background as Beatrice experienced the overwhelming emotion of becoming a mother. But that moment was brief, as the reality of having a premature baby quickly reasserted itself. The baby, who would later be named Sienna Elizabeth, weighed just 4 pounds and required immediate assistance with breathing. The neonatal intensive care team took over quickly, their movements precise and practiced as they stabilized the tiny infant. Beatrice caught only a glimpse of her daughter before she was whisked away to the NICU, a moment that felt both like everything and nothing at the same time. "She's breathing on her own, which is excellent for 32 weeks, Dr. Richardson, the head of neonatal care, explained as they prepared to transfer Sienna to the intensive care unit. "Her APGAR scores are better than we typically see at this gestational age. You should feel encouraged by that." Beatrice tried to hold on to those words as she watched her daughter disappear through the doors that would separate them for the foreseeable future. The recovery room felt unnaturally quiet after the intensity of the delivery. Eduardo sat beside her bed, both of them processing what had just happened. Their daughter was alive and fighting, but the journey ahead was unclear. The carefully planned maternity leave, the nursery ready at home, the stack of congratulations cards waiting to be sent, all of it would have to wait while they navigated the complex world of NICU care. "When can I see her?" Beatrice asked, though she already suspected the answer wouldn't be immediate. The medications from surgery made everything feel slightly disconnected, but her desire to hold her daughter was sharp and clear. Dr. Mitchell explained that once Beatrice was stable and mobile, she could visit the NICU, but holding would depend on Sienna's condition and the medical team's assessment. That first night was the longest of Beatrice's life. Sleep came in fragments between nurse visits, and the constant worry about her daughter just floors away. She found herself thinking about all the mothers throughout history who had faced similar situations without the medical advances and support system she had access to. The thought was both humbling and frightening, making her grateful while also highlighting how precarious the situation remained. When morning came, Beatrice was finally cleared to visit the NICU. The walk down the hospital corridor felt like a journey into an unknown world, one where her royal status meant nothing, and her role as a new mother was defined entirely by circumstances beyond her control. As she approached the doors to the unit that had become her daughter's temporary home, she prepared herself for whatever came next, knowing that this was only the beginning of an experience that would change her understanding of strength, vulnerability, and what it truly meant to fight for someone you love. The neonatal intensive care unit hit Beatrice like a wave of sensory overload. The constant beeping of monitors, the soft whoosh of ventilators, and the gentle hum of incubators created a symphony she had never heard before, but would soon know by heart. Rows of tiny patients, each fighting their own battle for life, filled the space with an energy that was both hopeful and heartbreaking. Nurse Catherine Williams, who would become Beatrice's guide through this new world, led her to incubator number 7. "This is Sienna," she said softly, as if speaking too loudly might disturb the delicate balance of care surrounding the tiny infant. Beatrice's breath caught in her throat as she saw her daughter for the first time since birth, surrounded by wires and tubes, but unmistakably perfect in her miniature form. Sienna weighed exactly 4 pounds and 2 ounces, her skin almost translucent under the warming lights of the incubator. A tiny nasal cannula provided supplemental oxygen, while monitors tracked her heart rate, breathing, and oxygen saturation levels. Her fingers, no bigger than matchsticks, were curled in tiny fists that seemed to demonstrate a determination that both amazed and worried her mother. "Can I touch her?" Beatrice asked, her voice barely above a whisper. The question felt strange coming from someone who had spent her entire life being told when and where she could interact with people, but here the rules were different. Here, medical necessity trumped protocol, and her desire to connect with her daughter had to be balanced against what was best for Sienna's fragile condition. Nurse Williams smiled and opened the small portal in the side of the incubator. Skin-to-skin contact is actually very beneficial for premature babies, she explained, helping Beatrice position her hand so that Sienna could feel her mother's warmth. It helps regulate their temperature, heart rate, and breathing. Your touch is medicine for her. The moment Beatrice's finger made contact with Sienna's tiny hand, everything else in the room seemed to fade away. The days that followed established a rhythm that became Beatrice's new normal. Morning visits before the doctor's rounds, afternoon sessions during feeding times, and evening hours when the NICU was quieter and she could simply sit beside the incubator reading stories she hoped her daughter could somehow hear. Eduardo joined her whenever possible, his presence a constant source of strength as they navigated this unexpected chapter of their lives together. Dr. Jennifer Hayes, Sienna's neonatologist, became Beatrice's primary source of information about her daughter's progress. During their daily conversations, Beatrice learned to interpret the complex web of medical data that determined whether each day was considered good or concerning. Weight gain of even a few ounces was cause for celebration, while setbacks like apnea episodes or feeding difficulties became sources of intense worry. Premature babies don't develop in a straight line, Dr. Hayes explained during one of their morning meetings. There will be good days and difficult days, sometimes within the same 24-hour period. The key is looking at the overall trend rather than getting discouraged by temporary setbacks. Beatrice tried to hold on to this advice, but found herself checking the monitoring displays obsessively, looking for signs that her daughter was getting stronger. The feeding challenges proved to be one of the most difficult aspects of Sienna's care. Born before her sucking reflex had fully developed, she initially received nutrition through a feeding tube, a sight that never became easier for Beatrice to witness. The goal was to gradually transition to bottle feeding and eventually breastfeeding, but the timeline was entirely dependent on Sienna's development and readiness. Beatrice spent hours working with lactation consultant Maria Santos, learning to pump breast milk and store it properly for the NICU staff to give to Sienna. Every drop is precious for a baby this size, Maria explained as she helped Beatrice establish a pumping schedule that would maintain her milk supply during the weeks or months that Sienna might need to stay in the hospital. The process was exhausting and emotionally draining, but it gave Beatrice a tangible way to contribute to her daughter's care. The isolation of having a baby in the NICU was something Beatrice hadn't anticipated. While friends and family wanted to visit and show support, the strict infection control protocols meant that only immediate family could enter the unit, and even then, visits were limited and carefully scheduled. The congratulations cards and gifts that had arrived at their home remained unopened, waiting for a homecoming that felt both inevitable and impossibly distant. Princess Eugenie, her sister, became an unexpected source of comfort during this time. Having given birth to her son August the previous year, she understood the intensity of new motherhood, though her experience had been dramatically different. "I know it's not the same," Eugenie said during one of their phone calls, "but the love you're feeling, the way you would do anything for her, that's exactly what every mother experiences. The circumstances are different, but the emotion is the same." The nights were the hardest part of Beatrice's new routine. Returning to their empty house, with the pristine nursery waiting for an occupant who might not come home for weeks or months, felt like entering a suspended reality. The baby monitors they had installed were silent. The carefully selected clothes hung unworn, and the rocking chair she had imagined using for late-night feedings sat empty in the corner. Sleep became elusive as Beatrice's mind replayed every conversation with doctors, every fluctuation in Sienna's vital signs, every milestone that other babies reached effortlessly, but represented major victories for her daughter. She found herself researching premature birth outcomes obsessively, reading medical journals and parent testimonials late into the night until Eduardo would gently close her laptop and remind her that each baby's journey was unique. The emotional toll of the NICU experience extended beyond worry about Sienna's immediate health. Beatrice began to grapple with feelings of guilt and inadequacy that she hadn't expected. Had something she did or didn't do during pregnancy contributed to the early delivery? Was her body somehow defective for not being able to carry her daughter to full term? These thoughts plagued her despite repeated assurances from medical staff that preeclampsia and premature birth often occur without any identifiable cause or preventable factor. Dr. Amanda Foster, a therapist who specialized in NICU parent support, began meeting with Beatrice weekly to help her process these complex emotions. NICU parents often experience a form of trauma, Dr. Foster explained during their first session. Your birth experience was medical rather than natural. Your bonding process has been interrupted by medical necessities, and you're dealing with fear and uncertainty while trying to celebrate your child's existence. These conflicting emotions are completely normal. The support group that Dr. Foster facilitated became another crucial resource for Beatrice, though attending required careful coordination with security protocols. Hearing other parents share similar experiences of helplessness, fear, and complicated joy helped normalize her own emotional journey. The group included mothers and fathers from all walks of life, united by the shared experience of having children who needed medical intervention to survive and thrive. Sarah Mitchell, whose daughter had been born at 29 weeks and was now a healthy toddler, became a particularly important connection for Beatrice. "The day you bring her home will feel like a miracle," Sarah shared during one group session. "But even after that, you'll probably check her breathing more than other parents, worry more about illnesses, and feel protective in ways that other people don't understand. It changes you, but it also makes you stronger." As Sienna approached her second week of life, small victories began to accumulate. Her oxygen requirements decreased slightly. She gained 3 ounces, and she had her first successful feeding attempt without the tube. Dr. Hayes cautiously described these developments as encouraging, while emphasizing that the road ahead remained long and unpredictable. For Beatrice, each positive update felt like a gift, a sign that her daughter was indeed a fighter. The media attention surrounding Sienna's birth had been carefully managed by the Palace Communications team, with only a brief announcement confirming her arrival and requesting privacy during this sensitive time. Beatrice felt grateful that her daughter's medical journey could remain private, away from the speculation and scrutiny that had surrounded so many aspects of her own life. This experience belonged to their family alone, and she was determined to protect that boundary. The question of when Sienna might be able to come home loomed constantly in the background of every conversation. Dr. Hayes explained that most babies born at 32 weeks stayed in the hospital until close to their original due date, which would mean approximately 8 more weeks of NICU care. The timeline could be shorter or longer, depending on Sienna's progress with feeding, breathing, and weight gain, but planning for anything became an exercise in managing hope and expectation. As Beatrice prepared for what would likely be a marathon rather than a sprint toward bringing Sienna home, she began to understand that this experience was teaching her lessons about patience, resilience, and love that no royal protocol or life experience could have prepared her for. Her daughter, fighting for every breath and every ounce of growth, was already proving to be one of the strongest people she had ever known. 3 weeks into Sienna's NICU stay, Beatrice had developed the ability to read her daughter's monitors like a second language. She knew that a heart rate of 150 to 160 beats per minute was perfect for a baby Sienna's size, that oxygen saturation level should stay above 95%, and that the gentle rise and fall of her tiny chest should happen between 40 to 60 times per minute. These numbers had become her new currency of hope and fear. The morning of October 25th brought the news that Beatrice had been simultaneously hoping for and dreading. Dr. Hayes approached her during the usual morning rounds with an expression that suggested significant news. "Sienna has reached 5 pounds," she announced, "and she's been stable enough that we think she's ready to try rooming in." The rooming in process would allow Beatrice to stay overnight in the hospital with Sienna, caring for her independently while still having immediate medical support available. The transition felt monumental and terrifying in equal measure. After weeks of having trained professionals monitor every aspect of Sienna's care, Beatrice would now be responsible for feeding, changing, and comforting her daughter through an entire night. The mother's room adjacent to the NICU had been prepared with a crib, basic supplies, and a direct communication line to the nursing staff, but it still felt like stepping off a cliff into the unknown. Nurse Williams spent the afternoon training Beatrice on the portable monitoring equipment that would track Sienna's vital signs throughout the night. The alarms might go off occasionally, she explained, showing Beatrice how to adjust the sensors if they became loose. "Most of the time, it's a technical issue rather than a medical emergency, but we'll be right outside if you need anything at all." The weight of responsibility felt heavier than any ceremonial duty Beatrice had ever performed. That first night together was a revelation in sleeplessness and joy. Sienna woke every 2 hours for feeding, her tiny cries filling the small room with urgent need. Beatrice fumbled with bottles and diapers, her movements awkward compared to the smooth efficiency of the NICU nurses, but there was something profoundly satisfying about meeting her daughter's needs herself. Each successful feeding felt like a victory, each moment of peaceful sleep like a gift. The rooming in period lasted 5 nights, during which Beatrice learned to navigate the practical realities of caring for a baby who was still medically fragile, but increasingly ready for life outside the hospital. Sienna's feeding improved daily, her weight continued to climb steadily, and her breathing remained stable without supplemental oxygen. Dr. Hayes began using the word discharge in their daily conversations, though always with the caveat that premature babies could experience setbacks without warning. Eduardo joined them for the final night of rooming in, his first opportunity to care for Sienna overnight since her birth. Watching him hold their daughter, his large hands cradling her tiny form with infinite gentleness, Beatrice felt the first stirrings of the family life she had imagined during her pregnancy. The picture was different from what she had envisioned, marked by medical equipment and careful protocols rather than natural ease, but it was unmistakably theirs. The discharge planning process began in earnest during Sienna's 4th week of life. A team of specialists evaluated every aspect of her care to ensure she would be safe at home. Nutritionist Rebecca Clark worked with Beatrice to establish a feeding schedule that would support Sienna's continued growth, while respiratory therapist David Kumar taught them how to recognize signs of breathing distress that would require immediate medical attention. The car seat test became a significant milestone in the discharge process. Sienna had to demonstrate that she could maintain proper breathing and heart rate while positioned in her car seat for 90 minutes, simulating the journey from hospital to home. Beatrice watched anxiously as the monitors tracked her daughter's vital signs throughout the test, knowing that failure would mean additional weeks in the hospital. When Sienna passed the car seat test with flying colors, the reality of bringing her home became tangible for the first time. The nursery that had waited empty for over a month would finally have an occupant, but not before extensive modifications to accommodate Sienna's ongoing medical needs. A home apnea monitor would track her breathing patterns during sleep, while specialized scales would allow for precise weight monitoring between pediatric appointments. Dr. Hayes scheduled Sienna's discharge for November 15th, contingent on her maintaining stable vital signs and continuing to gain weight consistently. The date felt both impossibly far away and frighteningly close as Beatrice tried to prepare mentally for the transition from hospital care to independent parenting. The NICU had become a strange sort of safety net, and leaving it felt like stepping into an ocean when she had only learned to swim in a pool. The practical preparations for bringing Sienna home were extensive and expensive. Premature babies required specialized formula and feeding supplies, medical-grade monitoring equipment, and modifications to ensure their environment was as safe as possible. The palace staff worked discreetly to install the necessary equipment while maintaining the privacy that had protected the family throughout this experience. Beatrice's mother, Sarah Ferguson, proved to be an unexpected source of practical wisdom during the discharge preparations. Having experienced complications during her own pregnancies, she understood the anxiety of bringing home a medically fragile baby. "You want to wrap her in cotton wool and never let anyone near her," Sarah observed during one of her visits. "But babies are stronger than we give them credit for, and she's already proven that she's a survivor." The educational requirements for NICU discharge were extensive. Beatrice completed courses in infant CPR, recognition of breathing emergencies, proper use of the home monitoring equipment, and signs of infection or other complications that would require immediate medical attention. Each class added to her confidence, while simultaneously highlighting how much could potentially go wrong once they left the hospital's protective environment. Physical therapist Linda Jackson introduced Beatrice to the developmental considerations for premature babies, explaining that Sienna's milestones would be calculated based on her adjusted age rather than her chronological age. "She'll likely reach developmental markers later than full-term babies," Linda explained, "but most premature babies catch up completely by age 2. The key is not to compare her progress to other children her chronological age." The final week before discharge was filled with mixed emotions. Beatrice felt eager to begin normal family life, but also terrified of losing the safety net that the NICU provided. The nurses who had become her guides and supporters would no longer be available around the clock, and the responsibility for Sienna's health would rest primarily with her parents. The transition felt like graduating from a program she had never wanted to attend but had come to depend upon completely. Dr. Hayes conducted a final evaluation of Sienna on November 14th, confirming that she weighed 5 pounds and 12 ounces, was feeding successfully, and showed no signs of the complications that sometimes affected premature babies. "She's remarkable," Dr. Hayes told Beatrice during their last conversation as patient and doctor. "Her resilience and progress have been exceptional, even by NICU standards. You should feel proud of how well you've advocated for her and participated in her care." The goodbye process with the NICU staff was more emotional than Beatrice had expected. These people had been her lifeline during the most frightening period of her life, and leaving them felt like saying goodbye to family members. Nurse Williams presented her with a photo album documenting Sienna's progress from her first day to discharge, a visual record of the journey they had traveled together. On the morning of November 15th, as Beatrice dressed Sienna in the going-home outfit that had waited in the nursery for 6 weeks, she reflected on how much both of them had changed since that unexpected day in October when their lives had been turned upside down. Sienna had grown from a fragile 4-pound infant fighting for survival to a thriving baby ready for home. Beatrice had transformed from a terrified new mother into someone who could read medical monitors, administer medications, and advocate fiercely for her child's needs. The drive home from the hospital was surreal in its ordinariness. After weeks of medical complexity, the simple act of placing Sienna in her car seat and driving through the countryside felt almost anticlimactic. But as they pulled into their driveway and Beatrice saw the home that had waited for them throughout this unexpected detour, she understood that they were not returning to the life they had planned. They were beginning an entirely new chapter, shaped by the knowledge that sometimes the most important battles happen before anyone expects them to begin. The first night at home with Sienna felt like living in a parallel universe where every normal sound seemed amplified and every silence felt ominous. Beatrice found herself checking the apnea monitor's display screen every few minutes, watching the green lights that indicated her daughter was breathing safely. The nursery, which had seemed perfectly prepared months earlier, now felt inadequately equipped despite all the medical modifications that had been installed. Sleep came in fragments measured by the monitor's gentle beeping and Sienna's feeding schedule. Every 3 hours, Beatrice would wake to feed her daughter, check her weight on the specialized scale, and record the information in the detailed log that would be reviewed at their first pediatric appointment. The precision required felt overwhelming compared to the natural rhythms she had imagined new motherhood would follow. Dr. Margaret Thompson, Sienna's new pediatrician, had been carefully selected for her experience with premature infants and understanding of the unique challenges they faced. Their first appointment, scheduled just 2 days after discharge, felt like a final exam that would determine whether Beatrice was truly capable of caring for her daughter independently. The weight check showed that Sienna had maintained her hospital discharge weight, a small victory that felt monumental in its significance. "She looks wonderful," Dr. Thompson announced after a thorough examination. "Her breathing is clear, her color is good, and her reflexes are developing exactly as we would expect for a baby her adjusted age. You're doing everything right." The validation from a medical professional felt like receiving permission to trust her own instincts as a mother, something that had been complicated by the medical complexity of Sienna's early weeks. The isolation of caring for a premature baby at home became apparent quickly. Well-meaning friends and family members wanted to visit and meet Sienna, but the heightened infection risks meant that gatherings had to be carefully limited and controlled. The simple joy of showing off a new baby was replaced by constant vigilance about hand-washing, mask-wearing, and ensuring that anyone with even minor symptoms stayed away completely. Beatrice found herself becoming an expert in developmental milestones for premature infants, learning to celebrate achievements that might seem insignificant to parents of full-term babies. Sienna's first social smile, which appeared at what would have been 6-week corrected age, felt like winning a lottery. Her ability to track objects with her eyes, to lift her head briefly during tummy time, and to show interest in high-contrast patterns represented major victories in their private world of careful observation and cautious hope. The relationship with Eduardo deepened and complicated during these early months at home. Their shared vigilance over Sienna created an intense bond, but it also introduced stresses that neither had anticipated. Sleep deprivation combined with constant medical awareness created an atmosphere where normal relationship dynamics had to be consciously maintained. Date nights were impossible, casual conversations were interrupted by monitor alarms, and physical intimacy had to be planned around feeding schedules and medical routines. The support system that emerged around their family was different from what Beatrice had expected. Rather than the traditional network of relatives and friends providing meals and babysitting, their support came from medical professionals, other NICU parents, and the specialized services available for families of premature infants. Early intervention specialists began visiting monthly to assess Sienna's development and provide guidance on appropriate stimulation activities. Physical therapist Amanda Chun became a regular presence in their home, working with Sienna on strengthening exercises and developmental activities appropriate for her adjusted age. Premature babies often need extra support developing muscle tone and coordination, Amanda explained during one session. "The exercises we're doing now will help prevent delays later and ensure she reaches her full potential physically." Watching her tiny daughter work through guided stretching and positioning felt like witnessing the most important therapy sessions in the world. The emotional complexity of premature parenthood became more apparent as the months passed. Beatrice experienced intense gratitude for Sienna's survival and progress alongside persistent anxiety about potential complications that could still arise. Medical appointments that showed positive development brought relief, but they also served as reminders of how different their journey was from typical infant care. The adjusted age calculations meant that Sienna's first Christmas came when she was chronologically 3 months old, but developmentally closer to 6 weeks. The holiday season brought unique challenges as Beatrice navigated family traditions while protecting Sienna's health. The large royal family gatherings that typically marked Christmas had to be modified significantly, with smaller groups, enhanced health protocols, and careful consideration of who could safely interact with their medically vulnerable daughter. The balance between inclusion and protection required constant negotiation and sometimes difficult decisions about which traditions were worth the risk. Princess and Beatrice's aunt proved to be an unexpected ally during this period. Her practical approach to royal duties and motherhood provided perspective that helped Beatrice find balance between overprotection and reasonable caution. Children need to be protected, but they also need to live and observe during one family gathering. Trust your instincts about what's safe and what's not, but don't let fear prevent her from experiencing life. By Sienna's first birthday, celebrated according to her chronological age rather than adjusted age, the transformation in both mother and daughter was remarkable. Sienna had not only caught up to typical developmental milestones, but was beginning to show signs of the spirited personality that had helped her survive those early critical weeks. Beatrice had evolved from a frightened, new mother dependent on medical guidance into a confident advocate who could navigate complex healthcare systems while maintaining perspective on what truly mattered. The reflection process that began as Sienna approached her first birthday led Beatrice to insights about strength, vulnerability, and the nature of royal responsibility that she had never expected to gain through motherhood. The experience of having a medically fragile child had stripped away many of the assumptions she had held about control, planning, and the ability to protect those she loved from life's uncertainties. Speaking publicly about premature birth for the first time on World Premature Today, Beatrice chose to focus on the strength of the babies and families who navigate this experience rather than dwelling on the fear and uncertainty that dominates the early weeks. Sienna taught me that resilience isn't about avoiding challenges, she told the gathered audience of healthcare professionals and NICU families. It's about facing them with hope and determination, even when the outcome is uncertain. The ongoing relationship with the NICU that had been Sienna's first home became a source of purpose for Beatrice as she looked for ways to use her experience constructively. Regular visits to support other families, fundraising for enhanced NICU facilities, and advocacy for improved support services for premature infants became ways to transform their personal struggle into broader benefits for other families facing similar challenges. The question of whether to have another child eventually arose, bringing with it complex considerations about medical risks, emotional capacity, and the desire to expand their family despite the trauma of their first experience. Consultations with maternal-fetal medicine specialists provided information about the likelihood of recurrence, while conversations with therapists helped process the psychological aspects of considering another pregnancy after complications. As Sienna grew into a healthy, thriving toddler whose premature birth became just one chapter in her story rather than its defining characteristic, Beatrice found herself able to offer perspective to other parents beginning their own NICU journeys. The terror and uncertainty that had defined those early weeks gradually transformed into gratitude and wisdom that could be shared with others facing similar challenges. The nursery that had waited empty for 6 weeks eventually became a space of joy and normal childhood chaos rather than medical vigilance and fearful hope. The monitors were eventually retired, the specialized equipment returned to medical supply companies, and the carefully maintained logs of weights and feeding schedules were stored away as historical documents of a journey successfully completed. Looking back on the experience that had changed her understanding of motherhood, strength, and the unpredictable nature of life, Beatrice recognized that Sienna's premature arrival had been both the most frightening and most transformative experience of her life. The fairy tale narrative of royal birth had been replaced by something more real, more challenging, and ultimately more meaningful than anything she could have planned or imagined. Her daughter had indeed been born a fighter, and in fighting alongside her, Beatrice had discovered reserves of strength and love she had never known she possessed.